So this diagram here is just kind of an overview of what we'll be talking about. You can see we sort of start in the smaller inner ring where we talk about accommodation, and then we move out to a broader category where we talk about accessibility, and then from there we go out to access. And the idea is that as we move further and further out into the outer rings of the diagram, our design decisions and strategies that we're talking about and covering apply to more and more people. So accommodations cover the smallest populations, accessibility covers more, and then when we're talking about issues of access, we're looking at the broadest possible audience. So we'll dig into each of these three, and we'll start at the center and we'll start with accommodation. So like I said, accommodation is usually the narrowest design focus. When we're talking about accommodation, we're talking about making an adjustment to the learning environment one time on one specific interaction for one specific learner. And let me give you an example to sort of help frame that. Maybe you have a learner who has dyslexia, and so they require an accommodation of needing extra time on an exam. Or maybe you have a learner who needs to go to the testing center in order to limit distractions while they're taking a test because they have ADHD. Or you have a learner who needs a note-taking accommodation because of a motor disability and they can't take their own notes. So they need to have someone else take those notes for them. Those types of things would be an accommodation. They're specific to that learner and their specific situation in that particular course. Other learners in the course don't get access to the accommodation, and the accommodation isn't carried forward to future runs of the course. It's sort of a one and done solution. And accommodations are generally very student focused and student driven. Maybe the student goes to someone in Lois's office in the Office of Student Access and works with one of the counselors. And then that counselor makes a determination that says, okay, this student needs this accommodation for these types of assignments. And the student goes back to the faculty member and with that documentation says, this is what I need. And the faculty member either provides it or works with someone like an instructional designer like myself to figure out what we need to do to provide that. And so accommodations are great and helpful and essential for individual learners, but they can't fix all the problems, and they do come with a lot of drawbacks. The first of those is that they are very reactive, right? It takes the student going and seeking out accommodation on their own before anybody even knows that an adjustment needs to be made. So not only is this only about 20 to 40% of the people, like we talked about earlier, going and requesting that accommodation, but it tends to also create a lot of work all of a sudden for both the Office of Student Access, sometimes someone like me, an instructional designer, but particularly on the faculty member themselves, who often then has to try to accommodate that learner in the middle of a course that's already running. We have to do it when it's requested, and it's essential and important that we do, but the reactive nature often really makes it a much more stressful solution than a lot of the other options we're going to talk about. The other thing with accommodations is there's just no way that accommodations will ever account for every learner, right? By doing them one at a time, one interaction, one learner, one course at a time, they're very narrow and specific in their scope and focus. But they do still have a very important piece in the puzzle, right? We'll never get rid of accommodations entirely, and sort of no matter how well we design our learning experiences. Just because there's so much learner variability that exists, there's no way we can design upfront with accessibility and access solutions to be proactive for every potential interaction or situation. It's just not possible. So while we want to minimize the amount of accommodations through other design strategies as much as possible, we're never going to eliminate them entirely. And so one of the ways we start to minimize the amount of accommodation work and requests that we need to do is by moving to the next ring out of the framework, and that's by talking about accessibility. So accessibility broadens that accommodation scope a little bit, where accommodations were focused on one time for one interaction for one learner accessibility is focused on sometimes for some interactions for some learners. And again, let me give you an example here. Let's say you wanted to caption all the videos in a particular course, or you were doing putting together some training that you were going to do in the library, and you wanted to do some captions for those. Or maybe you decide that you have a bunch of handouts that you use in the library that you frequently give to students, and so you want to go through and make all the heading styles in those documents, or add other accessible features to your course documents. Or maybe you want to go through and add descriptive alt text to all your images. That's what we're talking about with accessibility. We're talking largely about broader categories of content. And these are things that are good to think about when you are building your content to begin with. It's much easier to sort of build in accessibility features up front than it is to go back and remediate content and fix it later. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about accessibility. You're doing it for more than just one item at a time, but you're still focusing on a very specific area. And they're often carried forward from one learning environment or learning context to the next, right? If you were to make some changes and add captions to videos, it's not like you're going to go back and remove those captions the next time you use those videos. They end up being sort of a one and done solution. You do it once and it works for all your future instances going forward. And they also affect more than one learner, right? If you have captions available on your videos, everybody who watches that video is going to have access to those captions. It's not just for one person. But accessibility and using accessibility features in design still doesn't help all learners, and they still don't offer learners a whole lot of choice, right? So if you were to add captions to all your videos, those closed captions are great for learners who might be hard of hearing, but they don't do anything for a learner who has a visual impairment, right? That's not to say accessibility, though, can't be helpful for everyone. One of the things we often talk about when we're talking about accessibility is that accessibility is necessary for some, but helpful for all. So if we go back to those captions, a hard of hearing learner needs those captions in order to be successful, right? Without the captions in the video, they have no way of perceiving or understanding or using the audio content that's in that video. So those captions are necessary for them. But those captions can also be helpful for everybody else. If you are trying to watch a video in your headphones and it's a noisy room or whatever, it can be really helpful to turn on the captions and follow along. This is particularly useful if, say, you're following along with very technical or complicated content. Having sort of two different streams that the content is coming in on, both the audio that you're hearing and you can read the captions at the same time, can help you process that and understand that content better. So that's what we mean when we say accessibility is necessary for some, but helpful for all. So that's what we mean when we say, rather than being person-focused or disability-focused, accessibility is really content-focused. It's focused on making changes to that content to make it more available. And these types of changes are usually driven by either someone like an instructional designer or maybe the person creating the content in the first place. So maybe you go through and you decide you want to make all your content accessible. I mean, it's usually a blend of a proactive and reactive response, right? Sometimes accessible design changes are brought about by student accommodation requests. So for example, we have the video captioning form that you can use to submit all of your videos that you've created, and we can then get them captioned. And a lot of faculty and a lot of people will use that when they realize they have a learner in their class that needs those captions for an accommodation, but then it ends up being an accessibility request and an accessibility fix going forward. So that's accessibility. So let's go ahead and move on to the widest ring. Let's talk about access. When we're talking about making changes and adjustments to access, we're talking about things that impact many learners in many interactions many times. Now, notice I didn't say all interactions, all times for all learners. Even at this widest ring, there's just no way we're ever going to be able to cover all learners, which is why we still have those individual accommodations. But at the access level, we're considering things that aren't just related to specific disabilities or individuals or content. We're talking about removing barriers that might not even be a disability. For example, what financial barriers are there in your learning experience or your content? Do you require students to purchase an expensive course pack? Do they have to buy a lot of outside materials? Do they have to purchase a one-time use electronic textbook code to get access to their homework that they're never going to be able to reuse or resell again? These types of things can pose financial barriers to learning on top of tuition and course fees that can really prove problematic for certain groups and categories of learners who maybe don't have the financial means. I talked a little bit earlier about bandwidth. Is your learning experience full of high resolution video that a learner without broadband can't access? Are there a lot of interactive elements that they're going to need to be able to access or download? Do you require synchronous video chat that can be problematic for learners with low bandwidth? Do you require learners to create a lot of video? Like, do they have to upload a lot of things that can be even more challenging? Another barrier is time. We talked earlier about how 74% of learners fall into at least one non-traditional category. Many of these non-traditional learners are juggling complex schedules, and so it's difficult for them to fit their learning in. Are you asking them to commit several hours to one particular activity in one massive block of time? Maybe there are ways you can split that up into smaller chunks to remove or help lessen that time barrier to make things a little bit more flexible for them. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about access issues. So where accommodation was very person-focused and accessibility was very content-focused, we say that access is very experience-focused. We're looking at not just the individual pieces of content or how a specific learner interacts with it, but exploring how the entire experience and how it all fits together as a whole. These types of adjustments and design strategies are usually driven by a faculty member with some guidance from someone like an instructional designer. And the reason we usually sort of have the faculty member or the content expert drive these changes is because you know the people you interact with on a daily basis more than someone like a designer does, right? You know your audience, you know the type of people who are going to be using your content. And so you are better equipped to understand the experience and where those barriers might be. And so one of the ways that we work out sort of designing solutions that encompass this access tier is by including a variety of content, right? We provide learners those choices that we talked about. They can have a variety of different experiences, a variety of different engagement techniques and resources. And thankfully, there's a framework that we talk about that we use that helps us do this called Universal Design for Learning. We're just going to spend a few minutes covering this briefly.